The following talk is based on an article published in the journal Diacritics under the title Reason, Anamorphosis and the Snowden Case, and I presented it in a shortened version at the University of Alabama in November 2017 under the title Politics and Excess in the Contemporary Era. My name is Dominik Finkelde and I teach epistemology and contemporary philosophy at the Munich School of Philosophy in Germany. In the history of art of the 17th century, a new technique in painting was discovered. It entered under the title Anamorphosis into the history books, and maybe you do not know much about this painting technique of anamorphosis, and yet I'm sure almost all of you have looked repeatedly at anamorphic images, paintings, or frescoes, and here are some examples. What makes an anamorphic image special? Well, at first, that the painting's motives are depicted with a calculated distortion factor without the viewer in general actually taking notice of the distortion itself. Because if, especially in art, she were to notice it, our free play of imagination would be interrupted and we could not enjoy, for example, the beauty of a fresco in a cathedral's vault. In order to enjoy the fresco, the visual content transmitted to the image must be painted in such a way that the couverture of a vault is prospectively counterbalanced or annihilated. Here another image from the context of theory of anamorphosis. You see here one of the most famous ceiling frescoes of the 17th century, painted by Andrea Pozzo, where a dome is itself a visual illusion. This is one of the earliest examples of anamorphosis from 1685 in the church St. Ignatius in Rome. What makes anamorphosis special, in fact, is, as I said, that the painter adopts to the ceiling's curvature in perspective, but only on the condition that the observer maintains a pre-structured point of view. I can walk in front of Raphael's School of Athens, for example, back and forth on a very large bandwidth of information flow, but with anamorphic painting, this is different. The representation will disintegrate rapidly since any representation acquires coherence from a certain angle. This effect is even more pronounced in anamorphic works such as those of the famous sculptor Bernard Prince. The original of this anamorphic installation is a famous photography of Salvador Dali. Here's the original. And in the next picture, you can see nicely the effect of compression that anamorphosis achieves. This is the Prince installation seen from the side. It proves how important it is that the viewer remains at a constructed point of view so that the representation can appear. You see that the representation disintegrates into numerous subsets when you lose or when you leave this focal viewpoint. Suddenly, you see instead of Dali, a shark or a piano, a post or whatever, a multitude of individual objects pops up where only one object was seen before, namely the representation of Dali. I mention anamorphosis here at the beginning of my talk in order to make with it a transference to the field of politics, because what fascinates me about anamorphosis is what I call its structure of representation. Anamorphic paintings bind the viewer to a certain point of observation. Only from this point on, all proportions of the image of the representation appear in justified relations to each other and are clearly readable. The observer becomes an observer only at the place of the preconstructed viewpoint, that is, at the same time, the representation's precondition of its illusion of coherence to appear. My thesis is now that a political community is structured in a similar way. This can only be achieved if, similar to an anamorphic painting, the representation succeeds in structuring a place in which certain viewers then appear to give the representations veridicality. Or to say it in other words, a political community, in order to obtain a similar power of representation, must construct also a dialectical short circuit of two poles or of two moments, so that we actually have the citizens on the one hand and the political apparatus on the other, i.e. a political structure in which the citizens recognize themselves as citizens being called upon. Only when the subject sees itself addressed by what the French philosopher Jacques Lacan calls the big other, then the same big other becomes coherent as an entity under which the subject places itself willingly as a particular, as the individual somebody has called. Simply exchange Bernard Pra's installations with the frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan from 1651, and you have the same coherence of a political totality via the integration of particularities under one general term, the sovereign. My purpose of referring to this dialectic between viewpoint on the one hand and representation on the other is to outline at the end of my talk, with reference to the Snowden case, how political agents can leave the mentioned focal viewpoint. Where this happens, we have not, as one might think, a clinical proof of paranoia or schizophrenia, but paradoxical, the situation where an individual tries to open up a universality that can only show itself when doxa, the political rule, is left behind. But let us go step by step, and please forget for a while the reference to the Snowden case, because this and the relation of politics and excess will only become clear at the end of my talk. It is interesting now that also on the part of the individual subject we can detect a preconstructed point of reference as a structural precondition of subjectivity. And this has been analyzed especially by Immanuel Kant, and he does so in the context of his theory of perception. Immanuel Kant speaks of a focus imaginarius, so you could say a fantasized a focal point. And he speaks so of this focus imaginarius as a regulative fantasy that our mind needs to relate to reality at all. And Kant explains the focus imaginarius with reference to reason's need to presuppose a transcendental target point that gives acts of perception a goal of coherence, even if this target point is outside of experience. Why is this necessary? Well, Kant says because our mind can do no other than locate what it perceives in the fantasy frame of one world as a coherent totality, though Kant also says at the same time that this world itself is a senseless term because this world doesn't exist as an entity before us. We are always in this world already inscribed. So the concept of focus provides our faculty of understanding with an orientation toward an end, though Kant says that this end really doesn't exist as a totality, though we have to refer to this totality nevertheless. And Kant writes the following. It does so the concept of focus provides the faculty of understanding. It does so by directing, quote, the understanding to a certain goal, which, although the goal is only an idea, focus imaginarius, i.e. a point from which the concepts of the understanding do not really proceed, since it lies entirely outside the bounds of possible experience, nonetheless still serves to obtain for these concepts the greatest unity alongside the greatest extension. The focus comes to the fore as a regulative idea to help fend off unbound multiplicities and to seek coherence and harmony. I think that's the basic idea of this focus imaginarius. Our mind would be confronted with multiple multiplicities if it would not strive phantasmatically always to a totality of being. Because we need this kind of totality as a matrix where we locate the multiplicities of the phenomena we are confronted on an everyday life basis. This is also why we hook up to politics, to the sovereign, for example. Not only politics needs us as ideologically tamed subjects, but we need the big other, the sovereign, as a fantasy object to relate to a field of political experience in the first place, a field of political experience that can be tamed and organized and ordered, even if this taming is also, to a certain extent, a fantasy. I have visualized this Kantian argument by means of an architectural drawing and its vanishing point. I think you will remember from your art class in high school how a vanishing point can give coherence to objects depicted within a perspectival drawing. Take the left-hand side as the area of what Kant called the field of experience, and the right-hand side the area where the focus as a vanishing point is located. This vanishing point lies, in this case, as you can see, outside the drawing. With Kant, we could say it is outside the range of experience because it constitutes experience. It organizes our range of experiences coherently, but is not in experience. Let's make my argument once again clear. I mention here on the one hand the anamorphic deconstructed viewpoint as a condition of a coherent representation. In the case of Pras' installation, it is Dali. And on the other hand, I mentioned the focus imaginarius as the totality promising target object of reality, because both seem to be essentially for reality to appear. We need both. We need a preconstructed point of view, and we need our fantasy of a focus imaginarius. Only on these conditions reality appears to us as something that is somehow coherent. So what Anamorphosis sets in scene in a metaphorical way is the bipolar representation structure that defines the viewer from a constructed observation point, from which the proportions of representation, to be taken as political representation, all seem to be more or less coherent and harmonious. And what Kant shows us is that the outside world receives its potential consistency in relation to a fantasy that frames reality, a fantasy that is rooted in our mind. As I said, just exchange Bernard Pras' installation with the frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and you have the same coherence of a political totality. These structures of a knowledge-related fantasy now also concern politics, because we could say, metaphorically speaking, that similar to an artist, the people of a nation paint again and again in the genesis of their historical experience the form in which they see themselves as coherent. This can mean, then, as in the case of Germany, that a German community depicts herself differently in 1933, 1945, or 1989. In 1933, the Nazis came to power. In 1945, we have a cultural reference to die Stunde Null, the 0 hour, and in 1989 you have the end of the falling of the Berlin Wall. And of course the same holds for the United States as well. In this process, the individual citizen emerges within these frameworks of narratives, but also the vision emerges of what the political representation of a community is about. These processes are not simply neutral or pending on a clearly defined group of participants, but they are essentially self-imaginative and, as such, politically charged. The community relates to these fantasies time and time again to form a picture of itself, and it has to do that in a way. I referred to Kant here in order to make clear that he, Kant, too, already knows that fantasies are part of the constitution of our reality. As I said, there would be no field of experience without the illusion of the mentioned focus imaginarius. Or I would even go so far and say that the individual object before me, even the individual object before me, let's say the microphone or the table, would not appear as an entity if the illusion of a world at the entity's background matrix would not be imagined unthematically at the same time. But as I said, I cannot place these fantasies as an object before me. Why? Because they are precisely, as in the case of Kant, the condition of the possibility of knowledge, and in the case of the community, the condition of politics in the narrative knitting the collective into the virtuality of its own coherence. So the political communities cannot really see the virtuality in their image they maintain. This fantasy is the off-screen condition of political representation. A political community is not able, in general, to recognize the cultural and historically guaranteed construction angle from which it recognizes and also symbolically celebrates itself as an entity with collective properties. Every culture, then, has its own and historically guaranteed form of reception of what it means to be itself and the form of reception of various conflicts, wars, and crises as well. The community, therefore, lives in its own normative anamorphosis as the condition of its normative possibility to be what it is. This is necessary for the political community to establish itself. Political facts are always conditioned by various distortions or condensations which constitute a community in their self-descriptions. Just like the condensation of subsets in the installation of Bernard Pras first makes the representation of Dali appear. In other words, every community guarantees a virtual point from which it reflects itself back into its own being in accordance with its own historical fantasy. What do I mean by that? Take again the Dali installation. It generates a cognitive moment where the image constitutes both its representation and the observer in the viewpoint. For the observer is only one if she is at the preconstructed point of view of the representation. Only then she observes something. When the subject leaves the preconstructed point of view, subsets begin to emerge. Something like noise in the representation disintegrates. Also something that we see very fittingly in the Dali installation. I would like to give you some examples of my assertion as to why members of a community are constituted around anamorphically distorted facts within their space of reasons. The distortions I refer to here are easy to find all over the political sphere, from the labor market to foreign policy. An example of a normative anamorphosis is, for example, the concept of human rights ratified by the United Nations in the year 1948 and criticized early on, especially by Hannah Arendt. It exemplifies nicely what Ernesto Laclau calls a signifier's emptiness, as only an axiom can effectively flesh out what the term human rights is supposed to denote in certain historical context as a universal norm. Political conflicts over who is violating these rights show how the term is at the same time an overdetermined and an underdetermined object of dispute, as it calls forth definitions to explicate what juridical framework defines its actual meanings. Just recall an anamorphic compression of the concept human rights with the help of the so-called torture memos mandated on behalf of the Bush administration in the year 2002. The torture memos, advising enhanced interrogation techniques, prove how, even for a well-respected democracy, the adaptation of the term human rights can be counterintuitively redefined simply by the fact that waterboarding, for example, is not declared as torture and as such cannot be a violation of human rights. And I would call this an anamorphic compression of a fact to morph into another fact. With the words of Willard van Orman Quine's famous rejection of linguistic reference in his theory of radical translation, we could say the reference to the human rights is nonsense, I quote, except relative to a coordinate system, end quote. But who establishes this? Is it me? And if this is obviously not the case, can I be sure it is well established anyway in the political sphere we live in? The lack of an absolute frame of reference can provoke well-known conflicts of interpretation where one frame perceives in another's understanding, for example, of human rights, an anamorphic perversion of the meaning of human rights itself. While inside the mentioned coordinates of a nation-state, the use may be inferentially not only well related to other terms, but also deeply be enrooted in historical background knowledge. Therefore, it is more apt to call the concept of human rights with Slavoj Žižek a sublime object of ideology. It is at the limit of the political and as such functions as a mold of concrete and historically partly contingent and pragmatically related interpretations of what its true denotation is. Then, as such, the word human rights is, metaphorically speaking, anamorphic because it is the mold in which political debates find their source of animation, especially through the terms virtuousness of being semi-empty, i.e. being underdetermined and overdetermined at the same time. Now, the same holds true for the word privacy in the coordinate system of the Patriot Act of 2001 that Edward Snowden obviously took offense at. But I get to this later. To make the idea of anamorphic condensations even more comprehensible, think of how Western states cooperate politically and economically with countries that violate continuously various human rights, like China or Saudi Arabia, but with exactly the same reference to human rights, implement economic sanctions against countries that are less cooperative with their interests. For this reason, the European Union is politically mild against China. No country wants to spoil its relation to this marketplace, but these nations nevertheless are not very mild against Iran, which, compared with China, has at least democratic elections. On almost every level of political reality, we meet pragmatically justified torsions or distortions or condensations of political facts that, in their operatic contradictions, cannot truly be represented. Many institutions of civil society, from unions and religious communities to editorial boards of newspapers, participate in the maintenance of a coordinate system as the normative anamorphosis that establishes a hegemonic field of norms and values. In this regard, even democracies are not of a different nature than totalitarian regimes. They might, of course, be outstandingly apt in enduring robust normative dissonances, but this does not hinder them from also shaping their facts and states of affairs transcendentally in favor of also of political interests. So just as the artist of an anamorphic installation, take the installation of Bernard Brass again, needs to construct a clearly defined focus as the precondition of any representation, each political community needs a structure of education, of rule observance and obedience, so that citizens encounter a world where facts and state of affairs confirm them as citizens within these facts and state of affairs. Where political judgment nevertheless tries to do so, where it tries to slip through the structural deadlock of normativity, it immediately provokes a fear that the entire political reality is in peril. And a body politic needs a normative anamorphosis or fact condensation for the confirmation of its own reasonability. A nation does not seek out its political reality first and then construct a coherent corresponding anamorphic condensation of norms to relate to this reality. It is the other way around. In a generic process that has developed over centuries, an inner space and an outer space of reason becomes established through a constitutive parallax gap between this inner and this outer world. What is this gap? Well, metaphorically speaking, the recognition of a constitutive not recognizability of anamorphosis within the body politic. And therefore one could say, anamorphosis as a political factor lays open the structure of a fantasy object that the subject perceives, but that at other times is itself the unsymbolizable instance of reality. Think again of the sculpture of Brass. Here the constitutive gap of a foundational non-recognizability would be the fact that the observer is not supposed to recognize the extent to which the image presented to him is based on various subtly condensed subsets. The whale, for example, as a subset of the installation seen from the side is simply not the same entity as seen from the pre-constructed viewpoint. We have a condensation of information feedback loops that cannot reflect on itself in the act of perception. This kind of condensation of information feedback loops is also known within empirical psychology with regard to our visual perception apparatus. A variety of research studies have shown that our mind classifies the reality around us according to patterns. Thus, our visual apparatus recognizes states of affairs through certain patterns of knowledge. But these patterns of knowledge also pre-structure the field of vision in the first place. This helps our mind to focus our attention on what is really crucial. If my visual apparatus would not be filled in permanently when I'm jogging, for example, in the English Garden of Munich, with templates that harmonize to my right and to my left my field of vision, I would probably be looking constantly to the right and the left as if I were not running in the English garden, but in a dangerous jungle. The same is true of a political community. If various media, from CNN to Fox News, would not continually deliver well-balanced, or whatever you call well-balanced, patterns of information as part of an information cocktail that support us anamorphically within our imaginary body politic, a body politic that we always already internally anticipate, we would be horribly frightened by all kinds of catastrophes around the world. The impact of imagination in reality formation of a body politic has also been analyzed by the French philosopher Jacques Lacan that I already mentioned. He maintains, for example, that our understanding of political reality is essentially maintained by imaginative and virtual beliefs, whereby the reality of our everyday life would break down immediately, similar to a mental breakdown if this alimentation of fantasies and imagination would be lacking. Fantasies help the mind to confront a world void of an inner essence, lacking a metaphysical purpose. Therefore, it is misleading to imply a clear-cut division between the realm of pathologically fantasized virtualities on the one hand, let's say dreams, hallucinations, ideological world pictures, and separated therefrom, on the other hand, the realm of truth-apt propositions corresponding bijectively with facts and states of affairs according to univocal reason. Our everyday understanding of reality always combines virtuality and reality insofar as the latter, reality, is gathered around normative claims of reasons, appellations and calls that are essential for subjectivity to emerge, and these are also virtual moments. And as I try to show, these virtualities keep the anamorphic space of the body politic together. Only in the aftermath of political breakdowns, such as the one of 1989, the downfall of the Berlin Wall, for example, the individual is suddenly aware or can be aware how and to what extent he has given his life energy to an unwarranted fantasies of the big other. In situations like these, he suddenly sees himself standing in some kind of desert of the real that Robert Pfaller calls the area of the illusions of the others. Even though the following image may appear a little extreme, I think it is nevertheless very fitting to metaphorically depict the exposure of an individual to an anonymous superstructure which Lacan prominently calls the big other. And I think most of you will know the depicted scene. It's from the Matrix movie. The hero disconnects himself in the scene from neuronal connecting cables that supplied his brain with stimulated inputs as material for his qualia, i.e. his mental experiences of reality. This film scene may illustrate well the extent to which we all may be energy suppliers to an anonymous machinery that we never totally understand and that keeps us in a certain place through anamorphic condensations of facts without letting us know in detail what kind of leviathan we are actually feeding. And Hegel would say that we can only see this from the future anyway. Why is that so hard to see? Well, the reason is, as I've tried to explain with the help of Anamorphosis, that the big other has pre-structured a place for us from which reality first realizes itself within the framework of fundamental certainties or fundamental fantasies. I think it likely that public servants had and still have similar experiences in the wake of or after the utter collapse of their state apparatuses like Neo. One must merely think of the collapse of an established recognition system such as that of the German Democratic Republic in 1989. People who had served East Germany's systems of recognition were, in the year 1989, epistemically dislocated, or rather anamorphically liberated by another recognition system that proved how testimonial knowledge had been distorted over decades. But it proved, of course, it from another distortion, that of Western Germany. We are, similar to Neo, literary enshrined or encapsulated in facts of the established political order and in their pragmatic procedures. But this encapsulation cannot be represented entirely. Therefore, a radical break with collectively maintained facts is probably indeed as painful as the Matrix film wonderfully brings to light in this scene. In this sense, then, the image of Neo ensnared in adhesive slime and fighting to get out of his anamorphic dislocation in the big other is a fitting image of how closely we have to understand our existence or our Dasein's so-called second, that means political nature, as parasitically adhering to our first nature, our bodies, and how difficult or rather impossible it is to break its shell in an act that transforms our conditions of subjectivation. Now the question is important, why is this so difficult? Well, precisely because of the libidinal dimension by which we are called upon as subjects. Having the honor, for example, to work for a certain agency in an anamorphic field of political enjoyment. But again, let me stress the point once again. The parasitical dimension of second nature, reason within a libidinal dimension of enjoyment, is the off-scene condition of individual freedom and political space at the same time. The reason why it truly makes sense to speak of libidinal structures of enjoyment results from the fact that we always enjoy our various political roles. If, for example, I'm a Bavarian civil servant, ein Beamter, I'm always more under a certain perspective than an ordinary citizen. There's a sublime body in me infecting my biological body with a surplus of enjoyment and meaning. When I'm a judge at a court, the law actually speaks through me. Being a judge or being a teacher, a doctor are outstanding forms of our second nature. So if there are subjects willing to cut themselves out of their second nature, of their political role, with all the pain that is required, then they do so because they may actually truly be crazy or because they personify, not less crazily, their subjective status as a limit to the world. In this case, they may see things quite differently from their fellow human beings because they have left, like in the case of Bernard Parr's installation, the pre-constructed viewpoint and are confronted with multiple multiplicities that have been tamed by the big other. A radical and excessive act crisscrosses established epistemic certainties as the subject no longer has the means to perceive through normative networks of explanatory power what reality is about. The subject then aligns its desire on a partially normative, uncertain space. But though these subjects might appear to us as terrorists or lunatics or traitors or whatever, what they strive for is exactly to fill in the lack of meaning in the big other with their form of subjectivizing a new aspect of reality, an aspect that can only be born and carried into the unlimited space of multiple multiplicities through them. This is also a topic that I mentioned in my book, Excessive Subjectivity, with reference to Kant, Hegel, and Lacan. The success of individuals in their acts of self-constitution depends then largely on an excess of imagination with which they defend themselves against the collectively shared imagination which they may perceive as paranoid. I think such a painful cutting out of second nature has, for example, been accomplished by Edward Snowden. His treason shows how paranoia-like delusions of a single individual, or to say it less drastically, a neurotic oversensitivity with regard to neglected dimensions of political reality, might provide this same individual with the power to abandon certain axioms of reference, let's call them viewpoints as in Anamorphosis, that are so far essential for the establishment of a certain political reality to maintain facts in certain states of affairs. One could say that Snowden left an anamorphically compressed space of norms in the NSA in which certain assumptions forced themselves by reason on employees on the National Security Agency. And my claim is that in certain political situations, an individual might be justified to leave, like Snowden, the mentioned anamorphically compressed space of commitments and entitlements with reference to himself phantasmagorically seen by himself from the future. So while at the place of the preconstructed viewpoint everything appears harmonious, very different entities pop up when the place of the preconstructed viewpoint that maintains the political representation is left behind. And I think this is, for example, what Snowden did. He left behind a certain representation of facts. Think again of the image of the Dali sculpture by Bernard Pras. Here, the entire representation suddenly disintegrates and subsets of multiple multiplicities suddenly appear invasive when the constructed viewpoint is left behind. How can such a shift in aspect seeing happen? I think we only have to look for a few weeks the news media of other cultures in order to recognize to what extent our facts are dependent on our interests. Fortunately or horribly, depending on how you want to see it, political reality shows us that there are always people who cut themselves loose from the position that the anamorphic compression of facts prescribed to them. But such an act is dangerous since the person who carries it out always more or less enters an area of illegality. A voluntary act of the individual's part to excessively overemphasize his place of reasoning and to hit literally out at the fantasies of others is needed. And when this happens, these subjects articulate isolated hyperbolic position, and I give you here some examples. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Or, as in the case of Martin Luther, here I stand, I can do no others to help me God, amen. Even if these famous citations touch upon very different historically contexts, they express a similar structure of an agent's divisive self-performance. Many more could be found, but these may be satisfactory for the sake of argument here. The heralds of these propositions that are beyond veridicality, are not obliged to be equipped with supernatural forces. We do not have to presuppose that they see an antagonism-free reality. The only thing they must be convinced of is that through their illegal act alone, through their leaving the preconstructed viewpoint of what facts are about, a new reality might pop up. Instead of attributing magical powers through divine intervention to excessive personalities, it might be more fitting to describe their lives as based on subjective acts of subtraction. Acts that have something to do with the extraction of judgments founding axioms or premises in relation to the politically charged episteme of their environments. A new world picture, that's a quote from Heidegger, emerges not by depicting a radically new image inside the frame of reference, but by a minimal displacement of the subject to the referential system of the political doxa, for example. As insignificant as this displacement may appear at the beginning, immediately or in the long run it might cause radically new ontological and normative consequences. A person in the recent political history of the United States has done this, and this is, as I already mentioned, Edward Snowden. Did he act reasonable in publishing classified information? I do not think so. I would say rather, with reference to the French philosopher Žižek and Badiou, that he made himself sensitive for reasons only retrospectively after his act of agency, because also these subjects in these situations are not sure about what they are striving for. They might only have some kind of intuition that the value they are defending again will be found or accepted in the future through them. Let us assume speculatively that Snowden, as a faithful Kantian, had, before the disclosure of classified information, asked himself whether or not the following maxim corresponds to the Kantian categorical imperative. So that would be his maxim. Is my action of leaking secret information to the public universalizable if the state I'm working for abuses a civil right protected by the Constitution? Since Kant, under very limited conditions, allows the right to resistance, this kind of test of the categorical imperative advances into a state of uncertainty. After all, who judges whether the state's invasion of privacy violates the Constitution in such a way that reason can be ethically allowed? The categorical imperative cannot give an answer to this question, as the answer is the precondition of the testing in a way. In general, Kant rejects the right of resistance or revolution because any revolution would abolish the formal playground of politics, the political sphere. You see, when assessing a political situation or political crises, it is not always obvious which maxim is to be tested at all, since even the assessment of a political situation requires premises. In general, Kant advocates that resistance to the state is forbidden. In Hegel, however, we find a divergent conviction, because Hegel repeatedly devotes his thought to excessive loners, and Snowden was surely a political agent of this kind. As Hegel writes in his Philosophy of Right, in times of crises, an individual may very well be authorized to determine from within itself alone what is good in respect of any content, even if his or her fellow beings are not at all in agreement with their justification. But this hypothesis, as self-evident as it sounds, bears, however, at least three problems that we see dwelling also in the Snowden case. The first problem can be described as follows. For example, to grasp when a crisis has occurred or is about to occur, since precisely this question may itself already be conflictive in the anamorphic field of shared Sittlichkeit. Or second, to understand how an individual may have the right to determine, as Hegel says, what exactly in such a time of crisis is actually good and right. How can he deductively legitimize the rationale of his deed, as the latter is with high probability illegal? And third, the difficulty to understand how an individual can publicly justify what the general public cannot understand as justified belief in the first place. Why can they not understand him? Well, because he is exactly supernumerary in his argument to the description of what facts are about. For example, had Edward Snowden argued with representatives of the National Security Agency that his maxim of moral agency was based on the conviction to respect a constitutionally protected privacy, he probably would have heard in return from the NSA that the transcendental condition of privacy is first and foremost the protection of the state. Therefore, privacy has to be invaded to protect the state from foreign powers that use the norm of privacy for their own ends. And here we see conflicting beliefs where, you could say with Wittgenstein, each man declares the other a fool and a heretic, depending on the frame of axioms they refer to. Snowden obviously rejected this argument and provoked numerous international conflicts. To refer in a stalemate like this, involving two counter-excluding streams of arguments to reason, where reason is idealized as somehow floating above the crises, makes the actual conflict misleadingly vanish. Because reason is not hovering above a conflict, reason experiences its true limits only within the conflict when premises or certainties contradict knowledge at the basis of facts. My thesis now asserts that in situations like these, the individual, only from a purely negative point of self-reference, can implement what perspective it takes. In that sense, we can call Snowden's deed with Alain Badiou a supernumerary act. What makes an act supernumerary is the fact that the subject not only judges on a state of affairs as something to be scrutinized from the outside, but deliberately inscribes his subjectivity into a counter-axiomatic frame of his judgment as the condition to leave certain states of affairs behind. Badiou speaks in this case of an event. He calls such an event of the site X a multiple such that it is composed of, on the one hand, elements of the site and on the other hand itself. And if we transform this proposition in one pronounced by Snowden, it may sound like this. I, Edward Snowden, denominate my agency a multiple such that it is composed by elements of the site, for example, the context of my work as a contractor for the NSA within the United States space of reason, and secondly, of myself, who declares that my deed is being within the USA's space of reason without being necessarily in the NSA's space of reason as well. And Badiou brings this in this formula. It reads as follows. The event X is composed of the elements of its site, of Sittlichkeit, and the performative act of singularity that generates the event in the first place as an excrescence out of the body politic, out of and in confrontation with the body politic. As I said repeatedly, the agent sees himself entrapped in a situation of mutual self-annihilating arguments, pro and contra, which can only be overcome by the individual himself. Does this mean that Snowden knows more than others what is right or wrong? No, as even his act has, for acting, no argument in addition. The point is, or my point is, the act itself is the addition. Recall again the installation of Bernard Pras. Subsets that were normatively unimportant in the former installation of representation, because they were tamed by the overall picture, the big other, now float as invasive singularities on the surface of a disrupted field of visual perception. For the majority of fellow citizens within the viewpoint of testimonial knowledge, they are still in place, because these people are still in the constructed viewpoint, and for almost everybody to see efficiently so, because, well, the body politic works very good for them. Maybe Snowden saw, allegorically speaking, something of this kind in his pathological fixation of privacy under the axiomatic frame of the Patriot Act when he left the focal viewpoint. And while his colleagues could not see the details he saw as alarming, since they remained in place of the constructed viewpoint of the ruling representation, he, for his part, could not show or explain his vision. Why? Well, because his subjectivized frame of axiom was the precondition of it. The original image that made a certain segment and others hide according to the unconscious harmony of representation is now lost for the paranoid agent. And this is why he sees now in the installation, take the installation of Pras again, untamed subsets that become important for him, while the majority of the people see still the Dali representation as totally coherent and harmonious. In situations like these, it may indeed be a phantasmatic distortion of an individual like Snowden that crisscrosses the political paradigm. Why do we need this excess, according to Hegel's genealogy of political experience? To disrupt the hegemony of established imagination of Sittlichkeit, or speaking with Lacan, to disrupt the inferential relation chains of signifiers arranging the big other. Why do we need this kind of excess? Well, we need this kind of excess because it lays open retrospectively what was lacking in the first place. It helps us to disrupt a hegemony of established imaginations and refers us, as I said, to a lack in the big other. For reasons like this, for example, in the year 2017, Catholics also now celebrate Martin Luther, who once referred to the Pope as a servant of the devil. And even the Jesuits now grant Luther the status of a mental companion to the Basque Ignatius of Loyola. The reason why it is most likely to expect proclaimed acts of self-referentiality in the future is expressed appropriately by the Protestant theologian Karl Barth. He writes the following: "The law is the culmination of humanity in exactly the threatening double meaning of the word, culmination." I repeat the phrase: the law is the culmination of humanity in exactly the threatening double meaning of the word culmination. Inasmuch as the law, with its frightening and reality-constituting force, is the summit of humanity, I think this is what Barth wants to say, it exactly needs paradoxical self-nominations that are contrary to its established assumption of political reasons to break its anamorphic spell and to open it up. To open it up for new experiences within the subject-object dichotomy of mankind.